Teresa, okay.
I'm going to do it this way because I'll do better. Okay. Teresa Di Biase is a retired university librarian who has published a number of articles on the history of women in the American West. Grants from both the Episcopal Women's History Project and the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church have aided her in her long-term research into the career of Deaconess Margaret Pepper, the book of which is right over there if you're interested. Her presentation is From Mother to Ally, The Journey of Deaconess Margaret Peppers. That's called using your teaching voice.
Thank you. And if at any time you can't hear me, would you raise your hand? And I will try to speak louder. So I pulled a fast one on Joan. I changed the title of my talk from the time I submitted this proposal to now. So if you look at your handout, it has a different title, and I'll reference that too. I'd like to start out with a quote from a deaconess. Not an Episcopal deaconess, but a Methodist Episcopal deaconess. Lucy Ryder Meyer, 19th century, early 20th century physician, social worker, educator, and author. She is credited with reviving the female order of deacons, or deaconesses, in the Methodist Episcopal Church. When I came across this item that she wrote, and by the way, her nickname, I thought we Episcopalians would like this, was the Archbishop of Deaconesses. I was really struck by its, what seems to me, its perennial wisdom. The world wants mothering. The deaconess movement supplies the feminine element so greatly needed in the church, and thus is rooted deep in the very heart of humanity's needs. Many, if not all of you, know about the history of deaconesses in the Episcopal Church, but I'll just summarize this. Authorized by General Convention in 1889, the order's recognition depended on its being clearly distinguished from the historical diaconate, which until 1970 was reserved exclusively for men. Acceptance reflected the belief suggested by Lucy Ryder Meyer's statement, namely that women have been uniquely endowed with gifts for nurturing, gifts that needed to be shared with the church and the world. On the secular front, at this time, late 19th century, early 20th century, the progressive movement was extending women's domestic sphere into the public realm, while the social gospel movement gave further impetus to women of faith looking beyond their own parlors to answer the call of God. By 1915, some 25 years after the order was canonically recognized in the Episcopal Church, there were 3 training schools for deaconesses and approximately 200 women listed as deaconesses in active service. And here you see a quotation from a form of setting apart of deaconesses. Again, important to say that deaconesses were not ordained. They were set apart to assist the minister in the care of the poor and sick, in the religious training of the young and others, and in the work of moral reformation. 1915 is a significant year for one woman who had responded to the call to full-time church work. That is the year that Sarah Margaret Peppers, normally she went by the name of Margaret, enters the Deaconess training program in Berkeley, California. In most ways, she is not your typical deaconess candidate. Margaret is not a cradle Episcopalian, nor is she from the Eastern Seaboard, and she has not come from a comfortable economic background. Instead, she has been brought up a Baptist in Iowa, and her father had died in the poorhouse. She is an outsider, marginalized, if you will, in other ways, having been widowed at age 19. And she has a daughter born in 1911, when Margaret was only 17 years old. And here we see Margaret sitting on the steps of the Deaconess house in Berkeley, California, now the campus of CDSP, with her daughter. We don't know for sure how Margaret decided to become a deaconess, but we do know what preceded the decision. Her husband had died of tuberculosis, and by her testimony, she was left penniless, with debts to pay and a child to support. From 1915 to 1918, she attends the training school in Berkeley, which is located in a house known as St. Margaret's. While she studies and lives on site, Margaret's daughter, whom I call Hallie in my book, is cared for Margaret's sister-in-law, Martina Jury. And here we see how St. Margaret's built itself a few years after Margaret was a student. A home of Christian adventure. Margaret's own Christian adventure began in the Philippines, where she spends 10 years in 3 different postings, 1 in the indigenous north and 2 in Manila. Meanwhile, her daughter Hallie grows up in California, continuing to live with Martina. It's a complicated relationship which I use my imagination to flesh out in my book, The Second Mother. Part of the challenge in writing my book was the scarcity of letters and other documents, such as diaries, that might shed a personal light on Margaret's life and decisions. But I have seen letters in the archives of the Episcopal Church in Austin, thanks in part to the Frank Sugano grant that I received from the Episcopal Women's History Project. Thank you. And in these letters, Dr. John Wood, the mission secretary, is urging Margaret to be united with her daughter, even if it means abandoning her work in the Philippines and returning stateside. Finally, Margaret is forced to explain that Hallie has made her wishes known. She prefers to remain with her aunt in California because that is the only home she has ever known. So Margaret begins to exercise her ministry of holy motherhood at All Saints Mission School in Bontoc, a school for the indigenous Igorot children. Almost immediately after she arrives, she's put in charge of the girls' work, while the supervising deaconess goes on furlough. Her letters to Dr. Wood reveal some insecurity in her new position of responsibility, tempered by a pronounced sensitivity to injustice, at least toward her fellow deaconesses, one of whom is singled out for persecution by a mentally unstable priest in charge. After 3 years in Bontoc, her bishop transfers Margaret to Manila, where she is put in charge of the House of the Holy Child, an orphanage for mestiza girls, who are mostly daughters of American servicemen and Filipino mothers. And these mestizas are neither accepted by the colonial white society nor by the Filipino society. While at the House of the Holy Child, she advocates on behalf of the most vulnerable with the recently formed American Guardian Association, which is concerned with the care of these wards of the United States government. And you have to remember at this time, the Philippines was a colony of the United States. Margaret's own sense of personal failure to persuade her daughter to share her life in the Philippines is reflected in this poignant quote from a letter to Dr. Wood in 1923, where she says, "Though I may have failed with what is my own, I am therefore able to do perhaps far more for those less fortunate ones." Elsewhere she writes, "I have no home now," hence the original title of my talk, "for in her mind and heart, she has been cast out, not unlike these marginalized mestiza girls." But again, Margaret's bishop, with whom she did not get along very well, transfers her after 3 years, assigning her to a Chinese ethnic congregation in school in Manila. She's not happy about leaving the orphanage, which she feels is really the work she is most suited for. And by 1927, after serving 9 years in the Philippines, she is searching for a new posting, this time back in the United States. By then, her daughter Hallie is graduating from high school, and there is a chance to rebuild their relationship. Margaret accepts a newly created position in the Diocese of Olympia, my own diocese in Western Washington, as the first rural worker of that diocese. And that means what she does is go out to logging settlements, to mining camps, to fishing villages, to farms, catechizing and visiting homes, and putting in over the 7,000 miles on her car a year. Then comes the Depression, and the diocese is forced to scale back its work. Fortunately, Margaret has been supported all along by the United Thank Offering, woo-hoo, and the women do not fail her. Margaret continues to coordinate the rural Sunday School by Mail program, but Bishop Houston of the Diocese of Olympia, with whom she does get along, by the way, reassigns her to work mostly with 2 Japanese American congregations, one urban and one rural. Her special mission there is to the 2nd generation Japanese Americans, the Nisei, especially to the Nisei girls. And this is an image of about 1940 of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Seattle, and that parish still exists and thrives to this day. Besides St. Peter's, the other mission that she works with is St. Paul's. That's in an agricultural valley adjacent to Seattle, where the Japanese community has since the early 1900s labored to grow lettuce, strawberries, and other fruits and vegetables. anti-Asian laws passed in Washington and other Western states bar Japanese emigres from owning the land that they work. And then comes World War II, and everything changes. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, war hysteria, coupled with long-standing anti-Asian racism, forced all people of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast to leave their homes and livelihoods and go to live in concentration camps in the interior. Margaret, who has worked among the Japanese Americans for a decade, does not abandon them. When the people of St. Peter's are sent to a hastily constructed assembly center, that's what they call them, assembly center, on the county fairgrounds, she does what she can. She's not allowed by the government to live on the premises, but she visits frequently, running banking and other errands, and helping minister to her flock's spiritual needs. Meanwhile, she assists as the St. Paul's congregation prepares for its own exile to an undisclosed location. And this is a picture of the Assembly Center, known, and this name was given by the government, as Camp Harmony. They went there in April. Executive Order 9066 was signed in February. They were there in April, and I know at least some of you have lived in the Puget Sound area at that time of year, and the winters and the springs can be rather rainy. And this is what happens when rain and dirt get together. It turns into mud. These barracks, for the most part, were built in a very short time, unlike some assembly centers. Fortunately, I guess one could say, the incarcerees were not forced to live in horse stalls. Only a few of the single men at Camp Harmony had to live in these horse stalls, but they were not ideal environments by any means. And then Margaret does something so remarkable that the Seattle Times newspaper takes notice. She petitions the authorities to join her flock in the incarceration camp that is being prepared for them, even though neither she nor they know where that will be. She is the only Episcopalian in the country to do this. Though there will be some Episcopal teachers and other staffers hired by the newly created War Relocation Authority to administer the various camps. And this is how I first came to know about Margaret Peppers. I was commissioned to write a chapter for the centennial history of the Diocese of Olympia. And this was 1990. I knew this volume was going to be a collection of parish histories, even though the women actually founded most of the congregations in our diocese and probably in yours. These were, as they were written, they were stories primarily about men, clergy, and bishops. And I've long been interested in writing about women's history, so I was especially interested in finding any stories I could about women and in putting into a larger context the events of our diocese in the context of what was happening regionally and nationally. And when I was going through the files of the Bishop of the Diocese of Olympia, I came across this article in the Seattle Times, and I thought, now, isn't that interesting? I wonder about this woman. I did a little more research, managed to get 2 sentences in my chapter about her, but that planted the seed that really has been taking 30 years to come to fruition. The place where Margaret and her flock end up is called Minidoka, and it's located in the desert of southern Idaho. During the time of its existence, from 1942 to 1945, it becomes the third largest city in the state of Idaho. Margaret is not allowed to live on site, but she rents a house in the nearest town, some 30 miles away, and commutes every day to the camp. This is a picture of Minidoka. There was nothing there when the camp was erected, and what they did was bulldoze they bulldozed the sagebrush. It was covered with sagebrush, and what topsoil there was. And the result of that was that in the winter, it was a muddy morass, and the rest of the year, because it's a very windy place, it was dust. This quote from the camp newspaper, the Minidoka Irrigator, a censored newspaper like all the incarceration camp newspapers, still didn't paint a very glowing picture of the place. Minidoka, as we know it now, is a dreary, forbidding, flat expanse of arid wilderness. And by the way, it would get down to 50 below in the winter and 110 degrees in the summer. Margaret becomes part of an ecumenical Protestant ministry operating in the camp, but she also serves as deaconess to the Japanese Episcopalian congregation, whose membership includes not only persons from Washington, but incarcerees from Southeast Alaska and Oregon. Father Joseph Kitagawa, brother of the priest with whom she worked in Seattle, is vicar of the new congregation, which is called the Church of the Holy Apostles. Margaret again finds herself behind the wheel of a car, at first making trips to Seattle to fetch bulky items, because if you were forced into exile into this camp, you could only take as many belongings as you could carry in 2 suitcases or wear. So first she made trips to Seattle to fetch items that were stored at St. Peter's. And then, because Father Joe, as he was called, couldn't drive, she transports him to Idaho convocations and to approved visits to other incarceration camps in the West. All the while, she continues her work with young people and women whose lives will never be the same again. And I noticed that several of you are wearing Daughters of the King crosses. I should say that one of the things that she did at the House of the Holy Child in Manila was work with the Daughters of the King chapter that was there, and she similarly worked with young women at Minidoka. And Margaret's life is also changed irrevocably by what she experiences at Minidoka. When 110,000 people of Japanese descent, 2/3 of whom are born in the United States and thus American citizens, were suddenly uprooted and forced into prison camps. Does this sound familiar? Episcopal Church representatives at that time pleaded for tolerance and compassion, but there was no direct challenge to the injustice being committed. Margaret, who was described by Bishop Houston as understanding her Nisei girls better than their own mothers, responded to the crisis as a mother might, determined not to abandon her flock in their hour of need. Did she hear the echoes of accusations leveled against her by her own daughter, who may well have struggled with feelings of abandonment as she grew up thousands of miles away from her own mother? You'll have to read my book to get a full picture of that. I believe that in the crucible of suffering that was Camp Minidoka, Margaret came to identify with these victims of racial fear and hatred in a new way. Once she had viewed her calling in limited terms, to prepare her Japanese American youngsters to take their place in the church and in society. But with each passing month, as younger people in the camp left Minidoka for jobs and new lives in the Midwest and beyond, she was confronted with the suffering of those left behind, the first generation Issei, who had never been allowed to become American citizens, but whose dreams for themselves and for their children had brought them to America and kept them there. One of the last letters I was able to locate of Margaret's, she reflects on the plight of the Issei. I cannot help but wonder what the future will bring. Taken all in all, life is a mess for them. And this is a picture of a home in Seattle, which was, someone expressed their sentiment about the unwelcome of the return of the Japanese Americans would be. And by the way, there was a movement to send even the Nisei back to Japan and to strip them of their American citizenship. Fortunately, I'm happy to say that my own former university, the University of Washington, played a prominent role locally in the Seattle area against that particular strategy. Margaret and Father Kitagawa stay at Minidoka until the camp closes in November 1945. In Seattle, she works for a time, resettling the returnees, but many of her congregation don't return. Sensing it is time to begin a new work, she applies to serve among the Navajo in Arizona, but deteriorating health forces her to resign after just a year. In the end, it is her daughter, Hallie, who is the one to care for her. Margaret has come full circle in her life as a mother. Deaconess Margaret Peppers knew something of what it meant to be marginalized. Hers was not the world of the Episcopal elite. For instance, her Philippine bishop, whose own roots extended back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, considered her uncultured and unsuited for life along the Atlantic seaboard. A woman in a man's world, she had known poverty and personal tragedy, and I believe that sensitized her to others who were marginalized and worse, such as the Japanese people on the West Coast. Margaret Peppers was not only godmother to over 100 children of all races and nationalities, as that article in the Seattle Times said, but in the end, she became their ally in the struggle for freedom for all of God's children. George Weinland, who was the director of the Home Department of the Episcopal Church during the war, called her a woman of deep consecration and willingness to tackle the hardest jobs. And I dare say that is true of most of the deaconesses of the Episcopal Church. And for that, I am thankful. So before I turn it over to questions, and I hope you'll have some questions, I want to give a shout out, not for my book, although you can get it over there if you wish, but to my publisher, Blue Forge Press. It's a traditional publisher located in Port Orchard, Washington, but it's also traditional in that this is not a self-published book, but it's non-traditional in that it's a nonprofit, and all of the workers there, from the editors to the designers, have had professional careers, but they volunteer their time for this press. And the press has a special mission for publishing stories by marginalized people or about marginalized people, and it may be racially marginalized, it may be gender related, it may be mental health or on the autism spectrum. They have a film department too, so you could check out Blue Forge Press, and they are, if any of you have projects that might fit in with their mission, and you can read about their mission online, keep them in mind. So thank you very much. Yes?
In your research, did you run across Hiram Connell, he's in the Holy Woman, I don't know what it's called. But
The question was, in my research, did I come across Hiram Conant?
Connell.
No, I did not.
I think you'd be interested in him. He was a priest in Nebraska, who was actually an Episcopal priest in western Nebraska, who was actually taken from his church on a Sunday into incarceration.
I am aware that there was, and perhaps still is, a Japanese American community in Nebraska.
Right, western Nebraska. And he was a graduate of the Agricultural College at the University of Nebraska, originally from Japan.
Yes, I have heard of
I
him
think
now.
the book about him is called The Nissan Farmer.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, the
Yeah.
Nisei farmer.
Yeah.
I am aware.
Yeah.
Didn't ring a bell quite. Yes.
Hi, you might have said this. So when she graduated as a deaconess from the Teresa Di Biase School, she was then sent to the Philippines basically as a missionary. Was that her choice? Could she have stayed in the States, or how did she? Yeah, that's. And you might have said, I apologize. I was like researching as you were talking.
I don't know the answer to that. This is one of the areas where I have employed my imagination. And there's some possibilities. One is, I'll just say, to get away from her husband's family. And I do have some documentation to support that. Anytime, and goes back to my training as a historian, when I did feel the need to engage my imagination because of the lack of documentation, I didn't just pick things out of the air. It had to be plausible, and the documentation that I was able to find suggested to me some reasons, and part of that had to do with her husband's family.
Right, her husband had died, but the husband's family, so she left her daughter, and yeah, it just interesting. I mean, I'm sure, but thank you. I'm just curious about.
Why don't you say something about how she got her daughter? How she got her daughter, and why the family might not have been happy with her.
Unless we have to buy the book.
I don't want to say that.
Okay.
Don't listen to that man. By the way, was not invited to be the token male, as I've reflected several times just in the course of this day and a half we've been together. He has more creds than I have to be here. And I'll just say, ask him when you get a chance, ask him about his own mother.
Okay.
So.
Well, it sounds like, it sounds like she did great ministry in the Philippines until she was then going to be moved again, and that did not make her happy. So, thank you for that.
Yeah, yeah. Other questions?
So, question, comment. I'm not sure it elevates the question, but there's so many points of intersection with her story that I think knowing. So I teach. I'm a church history professor, and I have to teach history of the Episcopal Church and Anglicanism. all these kinds of
So
things.
they can't hear you, so over there.
Oh,
Can you speak
sorry.
up? Yeah.
I can repeat some of this.
Yeah, well,
So I teach history of the Episcopal Church and history of the Anglicanism, Anglican Communion, and this connects to the history of the independent church in Philippines,
yes, it does.
and the history of in the northern portion where she was as the Anglican enclave of that region, which becomes the independent. So that region is very, very important in understanding the Philippine independent church today. So piqued interest in that. But I do think that the Nebraska piece, the Idaho, Oregon, Washington piece, but also the Southern California piece.
That's where I'm from.
Yeah, so St. Mary's, St. Peter's, the Nebraska, there is, as a teacher, there is not enough on complicity on the part of the Episcopal Church in terms of the Japanese internment. And it's akin to our complicity in boarding schools. So I encourage you to beyond your book, to also publish something on that piece so that people like me can have resources. Because I think Japanese internment is something that there's not enough literature in our tradition to really understand our complicitness in it. So it's an encouragement and invitation for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And yes. you can examine later my name tag a little closer. I have a pin. It's in the shape of a piece of tag board that each family, when they were sent to the assembly center, had to put on their luggage and also on themselves. They were given a number. And this tag says, quoting from the Holocaust movement, never again is now. And every year in February, there is an observation of the day that Executive Order 9066 was signed. And the Japanese American community now are leaders in protesting and resisting the anti-immigration movement. You know, when I could go on for a long time, but when I actually started writing this book in my retirement, I mean, I was certainly struck by the resonances, but by the time 5 years later, I actually completed my manuscript. It was incredible and frightening what the resonances are.
Ironically, the president that signed that executive order was Episcopalian.
His
FDR.
wife didn't want him to, but I know. Yep.
FBI.
Yep. Any other questions? Or?
You have another opportunity now during our break if any of you want to pick up a copy of the book.
Thank you for bringing her to my attention. Yeah.
I'll just say one thing and then I'll shut up. But I do have a historical afterword in my book. And again, my training as a historian made me want to do this. But there are some incidents in the book that sound like, oh, she must have made that up, you know, for dramatic purposes. And I think the most outrageous in referring to the Japanese Americans, but also there's some other things in the book that seems like that should be a novelist's imagination, I document. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you.